There was a sound in the 1970s that meant something was serious. A low mechanical hum, the kind that came from a room you weren't allowed to walk into without a reason. If you worked in an office back then, drop ceilings, cigarette smoke, the smell of carbon paper, you knew that sound. It came from the IBM machine, and whatever was in that room, it mattered. IBM in the 1970s wasn't just a company. It was an institution, like the post office or the evening news or your father's pension. A parent who worked there didn't just have a job, they had a career. White shirt, dark tie, a briefcase that closed with a satisfying click. IBM men, they were called. And there was a pride in that phrase you could feel, even as a child. By the time the 1970s arrived, IBM had reached something close to total dominance. Banks, hospitals, airlines, government agencies, they all ran on IBM. The System 370 wasn't just a powerful machine. It was a platform, a commitment. Once your organization was built around it, leaving wasn't a business decision. It was an upheaval. And most companies, quite rationally, chose not to bother. There's a human truth buried in that strategy. We stay with what we know, not out of laziness, but because change is genuinely costly. In time, in energy, in the anxiety of the unfamiliar. IBM understood this long before anyone gave it a name. They built an ecosystem that felt like security. And security, it turns out, is something people will pay almost anything for. For the people who worked there, IBM offered something that now seems almost quaint, a life. You joined young, were trained and mentored, bought a house near one of their campuses. Your whole social world could be IBM-shaped. And in exchange came an implicit promise. If you were loyal, they would be loyal back. IBM didn't do mass layoffs. They retrained. They relocated. They held up their end of the deal. There was even a phrase people used. Nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. Think about how much that says. It didn't mean IBM was the cheapest, or even always the best. It meant IBM was the safe choice, the defensible one, the one that couldn't be questioned. In a decade full of oil crises and inflation and political upheaval, IBM was a fixed point. And we reach for fixed points when everything else is moving. But here is where the story gets uncomfortable. All of that certainty came with a cost that wasn't visible yet. IBM was so dominant, so surrounded by people who believed in what they were doing, that it began to lose something. The hunger, the curiosity, the willingness to look sideways at what was coming. In garages and labs, a different idea of computing was being born. Smaller, cheaper, personal. And IBM, almost entirely reasonably, didn't take it seriously. This is one of the quietest lessons that decade holds. Success can narrow your vision, not because you become arrogant, but because success is self-reinforcing. What worked before feels like proof it will work again. And slowly, without drama, the world moves on while you're still perfecting yesterday's answer. IBM would eventually respond. The IBM PC in 1981 was a remarkable act of reinvention. But the warning had already been written. Looking back now, what strikes you most about IBM in the 1970s isn't the technology. It's the feeling. An organization at the height of its power, doing what it had always done, doing it extraordinarily well, and believing with complete sincerity that the world would always reward that. We recognize it maybe because we felt something like it ourselves. Periods of mastery, of knowing exactly who we were. And then something shifted, quietly. What IBM built over those decades, the trust, the relationships, the reputation for showing up, that was the real asset. Not the machine. The machine changed. But the willingness to be the kind of company that people felt safe with, that lasted longer than almost anything else. There was a sound in the 1970s that meant something was serious. The most important thing was never the machine. It was always the trust.